So now that we've done HTTP requests using the HTTP service, we actually want to talk about doing something a little bit more effective. Now, at the long term, it's going to be more effective, and actually it's better for integrating with your API services. You still might need to use the HTTP service, but in this case, especially for posts or something that might be related to some sort of model data or an API data, we want to actually be able to integrate it just a little bit better by using AngularJS. So if you remember back, we actually added AngularJS in there because, well, we were planning on using it. And in this one, that's what we're going to be doing. We're actually going to be setting up the AngularJS stuff. And we're going to do this by creating a new folder inside of our app, and we're going to call it core. And inside of core, this is where we're actually going to create another new folder, and we're going to call this post, like our blog posts. We're going to make a couple files in here. The first one being post.module.js, and the next one being post.service.js. And the reason I'm putting it in something called core is because I'm going to be putting my resources in the thing called core. That's really just a way to separate my resources out, or the way this stuff's going to map to any given thing, just to make it even more concise to the individual thing that it's going to be doing. Like the post core service is really only going to get the post items from whether it's an API service, or right now it's going to be through our actual post.json stuff. We would do this same sort of thing if we had comments, where our actual controllers, that is having our actual components for the blog list, the blog detail, would be separated out. Core is just going to be something, the services that we'll be using to support the rest of the views and the way that things work. So in our post.modules.js, it's going to be the same thing as our blog module, but instead of being blog list, we're going to call it post, and that's it. And then in service, we're going to call it post still, but now instead of just using post, we're going to use something called factory. So dot and then factory. And now I'm going to use capital P for post, and I'm actually going to separate these things out just slightly and tab it in. And then in here, this is where we're going to be creating our resource. So we'll do comma function, and then our parentheses, and finally our semicolon there. So in here, we want to actually add in a service called resource. So this resource service is actually going to be what's returning our different things. So at the very end of this, we're going to return the resource, and we're going to return some URL, configuration if we have any of it, and then finally, we'll have our different shortcuts to actually run resource, such as query and get. These are the two that we're going to be working off of, and I'm going to put empty dictionaries in them right now. Now, let's go ahead and set this URL first. I'm going to say var URL is equal to, well, it's going back to that post URL. So if we go into the detail, it's going to be this URL right here. So let's go ahead and add that into our service. So this is getting our post lists. Inside of now our resource, we have that URL set up. Inside of this resource, we can now add in the various things. So we can add in the HTTP method. In this case, it's going to be get. We can add in parameters if we have any parameters. In this case, we're going to have it empty. So it's like any sort of parameters that you want to pass with your GET requests. We can say is array. Now, query by default is going to be array, but we'll just say true. We want to cache these results. Well, with a list of blog items, we probably do want to cache these results. So basically, when the service is requesting these items, it doesn't have to request them as often from the backend service. All right, so we'll cache it. And then there's a few other things that I will mention that we're just not going to cover yet, but it's transform response. And transform response will allow you to actually transform the HTTP response that comes through. And then the last one would be an interceptor. So if there's something with the actual request to the backend, this would right here be able to intercept that request. So if there's an error, if the server's down or something like that, this interceptor would be able to handle all that stuff. But again, we're not going to talk about this here. It's just wanted to mention it to you so it is there in the future. All right, so the GET request, we're actually going to have it be the exact same. So now we have a query as well as a GET. So these two things are going to be covering the same thing in this case, but really when you get down to it, once we have a backend service, our parameters, I'm going to have just comment this out, we would do something like ID and then @ID. We do something like that to actually pass in that parameter, and then we would change this to being false, right? So this stuff will be very clear once we integrate with a backend service, which again is something we're not going to do until we integrate with our Django service, which is in a different series, but it's definitely something to note here so you know about it. And then a GET call, especially if you're doing a single item that's not an array, you might not want to cache it. But I like to cache things just to make it speed up everything there. Okay, so now that we've got this post service, we can do some things with it. Let's go ahead and first of all add it into our actual index page, so our HTML page, and we're going to add it in as core/post/post.module.js. Can delete the rest of this. And then we're going to add it one more time, and that is going to be service. Okay, so now that we have this service, let's actually add this service into our component. So I'm going to go into my blog detail module, and in here, I'm going to put a quote and capitalized P, post. Now I can actually use this item inside of our controller as its own service, and I'm going to put it first because it's my own custom service. And then I'm just going to do console.log and post.query, and then console.log post.get. Now, do note that these are the same that's coming through here. Another thing you can do is just the $query and the $get. So if we come back in, we can actually see the documentation for this as well. There's a lot of things that are going on here. So you can actually research more about it if you look directly on the documentation. I actually added something that we don't need to add, and that's the $sign in front of those things. A little mistake there. And then we refresh now in our Angular. We get an unexpected identifier in post 16. So I made a little mistake there as well. So let's go back into the service. We want to make sure we have a comma here. And now this looks like a solid resource for us. So let's go back in and refresh. Now we don't have errors with the post service, but we might have some other errors. So let's go ahead and click on this. And we've got some errors as far as this is probably related to actually how we passed in our post detail. So let's make sure we've got everything saved up on all the different areas. And we'll come back in here. Oops, this might be lowercase p. And that's what it was. All right, so we've got our lowercase p now. And in here we have some data that actually came back. So if we click on that, we see that the requests are the same. So when we did this service, both of these are the same. And therefore, when we go into the component itself, both of these are the same as well. So something I can do is now I can just do post.query and then write a function in here that's going to handle that query. So this is going to handle the actual data itself. So let's actually put just data here. And now I'm going to go ahead and grab this for each item again, paste it in, and just call this data. And let's see if this part works in particular. So we refresh. Looks like nothing changed. We didn't have any errors, but let's get rid of that HTTP call. Let's just comment it out for a second and refresh in here. Notice the data is still the same. In fact, if I went through and just commented all of that stuff out or removed it all, which is actually what I'm going to do, you can check the GitHub repository for all this old code, but we don't need it in here any longer. We can now refresh, and this is working. If I change the item number, it's not actually giving me an error because it actually is still getting data. So we do want to actually put this back up, and we'll say true. We could put it back into this for each. We probably should put it into this right before the for loop, that is. just to make sure that that is working correctly. And we refresh. It looks like the not found is not working as we may want it to work for this item in particular, but that's okay. We will come back to that. Let's go back to our one, and if we refresh in here several times, it's still coming through. We might want to refresh in our other places to make sure that is all coming through and it has no errors as well. So that is actually a lot cleaner of code now than what we had before. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, cool. The code's a little cleaner here. Well, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is now is going into the post list. So the blog list itself, we add post in here, and then we come back into our component. We can use the service now of post and do the exact same thing. So going back into our detail, we can copy this here and we'll paste it in here. And now instead of items being blog items, right? So that's what we called it before. I'm going to go ahead and comment this out. And I'm going to try something different, and we'll just do post.query, save it, and we'll go back into our list, refresh, and now our post items are coming through just like that. So we actually don't need any of this stuff. Get rid of that. We no longer need these either. Or this other code. Again, GitHub will have all that. I just want to clean it up. Refresh. Look at that. Now it is nice and clean. This is now our list view. We no longer need this either. And our resource now made all of the difference. This made everything happen here. So we click and now we can see this. This is not just useful for querying the database, but it's also for updating the database as well. So using post, so post, get, put, delete, all of those things. This resource is what's actually going to be doing it for us, which is really, really nice. So to reiterate, when we want to map our functions, or if we want to map Angular to a API service, we will build our own resource services that map to that API. So right now, this maps in some form or fashion to the API. We'll see this in much more detail when we actually map it to a RESTful service, a real RESTful service. But right now, what we see is it's actually mapped to that API. That's really, really important, because then whenever we want to use it again, we can just do something this simple. One line for a list. Very, very useful. Very cool. Hopefully this is sinking in on how quick and useful Angular actually can be. If you have any questions on what we did with the resource stuff, let us know. We will definitely do a lot more of this resource, and I do highly recommend that you read through the documentation for this resource. So it's basically creating this object, as it says right here. It creates a resource object that lets you interact with the RESTful server-side data sources. In this case, we don't have data sources. We're just using the JSON data. So just like with the HTTP stuff, we would be able to eventually have an actual server that takes over this stuff. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.